I could hear them shouting when I shut the door of the room. They seemed to be running in all directions, and then came the sharp sound of the church bell in the rapid peal of alarm. Claudia had slipped down from my arms, and she was staring at me gravely as I bolted the door. Very slowly I unlatched the shutter of the window. An icy light seeped into the room. Still she watched me. Then I felt her at my side. I looked down to see she was holding out her hand to me. "Here," she said. She must have seen I was confused. I felt so weak that her face was shimmering as I looked at it, the blue of her eyes dancing on her white cheeks. "Drink," she whispered, drawing nearer. "Drink." And she held the soft, tender flesh of the wrist towards me. "No, I know what to do. Haven't I done it in the past?" I said to her. It was she who bolted the window tight, latched the heavy door. I remember kneeling by the small grate and feeling the ancient panelling. It was rotten behind the varnished surface, and it gave under my fingers. Suddenly I saw my fist go through it and felt the sharp jab of splinters in my wrist. And then I remember feeling in the dark and catching hold of something warm and pulsing. A rush of cold, damp air hit my face, and I saw a darkness rising about me, cool and damp, as if this air were a silent water that seeped through the broken wall and filled the room. The room was gone. I was drinking from the never-ending stream of warm blood that flowed down my throat and through my pulsing heart, and through my veins so that my skin warmed against this cool, dark water. And now the pulse of the blood I drank slackened, and all my body cried out for it not to slacken, my heart pounding, trying to make that heart pound with it. I felt myself rising, as if I were floating in the darkness, and then the darkness, like the heartbeat, began to fade. Something glimmered in my swoon. It shivered ever so slightly with the pounding of feet on the stairs, on the floorboards, the rolling of wheels and horses' hooves on the earth, and it gave off a tinkling sound as it shivered. It had a small wooden frame around it, and in that frame there emerged, through the glimmer, the figure of a man. He was familiar. I knew his long, slender build, his black, wavy hair. Then I saw that his green eyes were gazing at me, and in his teeth, he was clutching something huge and soft and brown, which he pressed tightly with both his hands. It was a rat, a great loathsome brown rat. He held, its feet poised, its mouth agape, its great curved tail frozen in the air. Crying out, he threw it down and stared aghast, blood flowing from his open mouth. A searing light hit my eyes. I struggled to open them against it, and the entire room was glowing. Claudia was right in front of me. She was not a tiny child, but someone much larger She was not a tiny child, but someone much larger who drew me forward towards her with both hands. She was on her knees, and my arms encircled her waist. Then darkness descended, and I had her folded against me. The lock slid into place. Numbness came over my limbs, and then the paralysis of oblivion. And that was how it was throughout Transylvania and Hungary and Bulgaria, and then through all those countries where the peasants know that the living dead walk, and the legends of the vampires abound. In every village where we did encounter the vampire, it was the same. "A mindless corpse?" the boy asked. "Always," said the vampire. "When we found these creatures at all, I remember a handful at most. Sometimes we only watched them from a distance, all too familiar with their wagging bovine heads, their haggard shoulders, their rotted, ragged clothing. In one hamlet it was a woman, only dead for perhaps a few months. The villagers had glimpsed her and knew her by name. It was she who gave us the only hope we were to experience after the monster in Transylvania, and that hope came to nothing. She fled from us through the forest, and we ran after her, reaching out for her long black hair. Her white burial gown was soaked with dried blood, her fingers caked with dirt of the grave, and her eyes, they were mindless, empty, two pools that reflected the moon, no secrets, no truths, only despair. But what were these creatures? Why were they like this? Asked the boy, his lips grimacing with disgust. I don't understand. How could they be so different from you and Claudia, yet exist? I had my theories. So did Claudia. But the main thing which I had then was despair, and in despair the recurring fear that we had killed the only other vampire like us, Lestat. Yet it seemed unthinkable. Had he possessed the wisdom of a sorcerer, the powers of a witch, I might have come to understand that he had somehow managed to wrest a conscious life from the same forces that governed these monsters. But he was only Lestat, as I've described him to you, devoid of mystery. Finally, his limits as familiar to me in those months in Eastern Europe as his charms. I wanted to forget him, and yet it seemed I thought of him always. It was as if the empty nights were made for thinking of him. And sometimes I found myself so vividly aware of him, it was as if he had only just left the room, and the ring of his voice was still there, and somehow there was disturbing comfort in that. And, despite myself, I'd envision his face, not as it had been in the nights before, in the last nights, I'd envision his face, not as it had been the last night in the fire, but on other nights, that last evening he spent with us at home, his hand playing idly with the keys of the spinet, his hand tilted to one side. A sickness rose in me more wretched than anguish when I saw what my dreams were doing. I wanted him alive. In the dark nights of Eastern Europe, Lestat was the only vampire I'd found. But Claudia's waking thoughts were far more practical in nature. Over and over she had me recount that night in the hotel in New Orleans, when she'd become a vampire. And over she searched the process for some clue to why these things we met in the country graveyards had no mind. What if, after Lestat's infusion of blood, she'd been put in a grave, closed up in it until the preternatural drive for blood caused her to break the stone door of the vault that held her? What then would her mind have been? Starved, as it were, to the breaking point. Her body might have saved itself when no mind remained, and through the world she would have blundered, ravaging where she could, as we saw these creatures do. That was how she explained them. But what had fathered them? How had they begun? That was what she couldn't explain, and what gave her hope of discovery when I, from sheer exhaustion, had none. They spawn their own kind. It's obvious. But where does it begin? She asked, and then, somewhere near the outskirts of Vienna, she put the question to me which had never before passed her lips. Why could I not do what Lestat had done with both of us? Why could I not make another vampire? I don't know why at first I didn't even understand her, except that in loathing what I was with every impulse in me, I had a particular fear of that question, which was almost worse than any other. You see, I didn't understand something strong in myself. Loneliness had caused me to think on the very possibility years before, when I had fallen under the spell of Babette Frenière. But I held it locked inside of me like an unclean passion. I shunned mortal life after her. I killed strangers, and the Englishman Morgan, because I knew him, was as safe from my fatal embrace as Babette had been. They both caused me too much pain. Death I couldn't think of giving them. Life in death, it was monstrous. I turned away from Claudia. I couldn't answer her. But angry as she was, wretched as was her impatience, she could not stand this turning away, and she drew near to me, comforting me with her hands and her eyes as if she were my loving daughter. "Don't think on it, Louis," she said later, when we were comfortably situated in a small suburban hotel. I was standing at the window, looking at the distant glow of Vienna, so eager for that city, its civilization, its sheer size. The night was clear, and the haze of the city was on the sky. Let me put your conscience at ease, though. I'll never know precisely what it is, she said into my ear, her hand stroking my hair. Do that, Claudia, I answered her. Put it at ease. Tell me that you'll never speak to me of making vampires again. I want no orphans such as ourselves, she said all too quickly. My words annoyed her. My feelings annoyed her. I want answers. Knowledge, she said. But tell me, Louis, what makes you so certain that you've never done this without your knowing it? Again there was that deliberate obtuseness in me. I must look at her as if I didn't know the meaning of her words. I wanted her to be silent and to be near me, and for us to be in Vienna. I drew her hair back and let my fingertips touch her long lashes and looked away at the light. After all, what does it take to make those creatures? She went on. Those vagabond monsters. How many drops of your blood intermingled with a man's blood? And what kind of heart to survive that first attack? I could feel her watching my face, and I stood there, my arms folded, my back to the side of the window, looking out. That pale-faced Emily? That miserable Englishman, she said, oblivious to the flicker of pain in my face. Their hearts were nothing, and it was the fear of death as much as the drawing of blood that killed them. The idea killed them. But what of the hearts that survive? Are you sure you haven't fathered a league of monsters who, from time to time, struggle vainly and instinctively to follow in your footsteps? What was their lifespan, these orphans you left behind you? A day there, a week there, before the sun burned them to ashes, or some mortal victim cut them down. Stop it, I begged her. If you knew how completely I envision everything you describe, you would not describe it. I tell you it's never happened. Lestat drained me to the point of death to make me a vampire, and gave back all that blood mingled with his own. That is how it is done. She looked away from me, and then it seemed she was looking down at her hands. I think I heard her sigh, but I wasn't certain, and then her eyes moved over me, slowly, up and down, before they finally met mine. Then it seemed she smiled. Don't be frightened of my fancy, she said softly. After all, the final decision will always rest with you. Is that not so? I don't understand, I said, and a cold laughter erupted from her as she turned away. Can you picture it? She said so softly I scarcely heard. A coven of children. That is all I could provide. Claudia, I murmured. Rest easy, she said abruptly, her voice still low. I tell you that as much as I hated Lestat... She stopped. Yes, I whispered. Yes. As much as I hated him, with him we were... complete. She looked at me, her eyelids quivering, as if the slight rise in her voice had disturbed her, even as it had disturbed me. No, only you were complete, I said to her, because there were two of us, one on either side of you, from the beginning. I thought I saw her smile then, but I was not certain. She bowed her head, but I could see her eyes moving beneath the lashes, back and forth, back and forth. Then she said, Two of you at my side. Do you picture that as you say it, as you picture everything else? One night, long gone by, was as material to me as if I were in... One night, long gone by, was as material to me as if I were in it still. But I didn't tell her. She was desperate in that night, running away from Lestat, who had urged her to kill a woman in the street from whom she'd backed off, clearly alarmed. I was sure the woman had resembled her mother. Finally, she'd escaped us entirely, but I'd found her in the armoire, beneath the jackets and coats, clinging to her doll. And carrying her to her crib, I sat beside her and sang to her, and she stared at me as she clutched to that doll, as if trying blindly and mysteriously to calm a pain she herself did not begin to understand. Can you picture it? This splendid domesticity, dim lamps, the vampire father singing to the vampire daughter. Only the doll had a human face. Only the doll. "But we must get away from here," said the present Claudia suddenly, as though the thought had just taken shape in her mind with a special urgency. She had her hand to her ear, as if clutching it against some awful sound. "From the roads behind us, from what I see in your eyes now, because I give voice to thoughts which are nothing more to me than plain considerations." "Forgive me," I said as gently as I could, withdrawing slowly from that long-ago room, that ruffled crib, that frightened monster child and monster voice. And Lestat. Where was Lestat? A match striking in the other room, a shadow leaping suddenly into life as light and dark come alive where there was only darkness. "No. You forgive me," she was saying to me now, in this little hotel room near the first capital of Western Europe. "No. We forgive each other. But we don't forgive him. And without him, you see what things are between us. Only now, because we are tired and things are dreary, I said to her and to myself, because there was no one else in the world to whom I could speak. Ah, yes. And that is what must end. I tell you, I begin to understand that we have done it all wrong from the start. We must bypass Vienna. We need our language, our people. I want to go directly now to Paris." I think the very name of Paris brought a rush of pleasure to me that was extraordinary. A relief so near to well-being that I was amazed, not only that I could feel it, but that I'd so nearly forgotten it. I wonder if you can understand what it meant. My expression can't convey it now, for what Paris means to me is very different from what it meant then, in those days, at that hour, but still, even now, to think of it, I feel something akin to that happiness. And I've more reason now than ever to say that happiness is not what I will ever know, or will ever deserve to know. I am not so much in love with happiness, yet the name Paris makes me feel it. Mortal beauty often makes me ache, and mortal grandeur can fill me with that longing I felt so hopelessly in the Mediterranean Sea. But Paris drew me close to her heart, so I forgot myself entirely. Forgot the damned and questing preternatural thing that doted on mortal skin and mortal clothing. Paris overwhelmed, and lighted and rewarded more richly than any promise. It was the mother of New Orleans. Understand that first. It had given New Orleans its life, its first populace, and it was what New Orleans had for so long tried to be. But New Orleans, though beautiful and desperately alive, was desperately fragile. There was something forever savage and primitive there, something that threatened the exotic and sophisticated life both from within and without. Yikes. Not an inch of those wooden streets nor a brick of the crowded Spanish houses had not been bought from the fierce wilderness that forever surrounded the city, ready to engulf it. Hurricanes, floods, fevers, the plague, and the damp of the Louisiana climate itself worked tirelessly on every hewn plank or stone facade, so that New Orleans seemed at all times like a dream in the imagination of her striving populace, a dream held intact at every second by a tenacious, though unconscious, collective will. But Paris was a universe whole and entire unto herself, hollowed and fashioned by history. So she seemed in this age of Napoleon III, with her towering buildings, her massive cathedrals, her grand boulevards and ancient winding medieval streets, as vast and indestructible as nature itself. All was embraced by her volatile and enchanted populace, thronging the galleries, the theatres, the cafes, giving birth over and over to genius and sanctity, philosophy and war, frivolity and the finest art. So it seemed that if all the world outside her were to sink into darkness, what was fine, what was beautiful, what was essential might there still come to its finest flower. Even the majestic trees that graced and sheltered her streets were attuned to her, and the waters of the Seine, contained and beautiful as they wound through her heart, so that the earth on that spot, so shaped by blood and consciousness, had ceased to be the earth and had become Paris. We were alive again. We were in love, and so euphoric was I after those hopeless nights of wandering in Eastern Europe that I yielded completely when Claudia moved us to the Hotel St. Gabriel on the Boulevard des Capucines, or Capucines, sorry. There's going to be a lot of French I can't pronounce here. It was rumored to be one of the largest hotels in Europe, its immense rooms dwarfing the memory of our old townhouse, while at the same time recalling it with a comfortable splendor. We were to have one of the finest suites. Our windows looked out over the gaslit boulevard itself, where, in the early evening, the asphalt sidewalks teemed with strollers, and an endless stream of carriages flowed past, taking lavishly dressed ladies and their gentlemen to the opera, or the opera comique, the ballet, the theatres, the balls, the receptions without end at the Thiers. Claudia put her reasons for expenses to me gently and logically, but I could see that she became impatient ordering everything through me. It was wearing on her. The hotel, she said, quietly afforded us complete freedom, our nocturnal habits going unnoticed in the continual press of European tourists, our rooms immaculately maintained by an anonymous staff, while the immense price we paid guaranteed our privacy and our security. But there was more to it than that. There was a feverish purpose to her buying. "This is my world," she explained to me as she sat in a small velvet chair before the open balcony, watching the long row of broughams stopping one by one before the hotel door. "I must have it as I like," she said, as if speaking to herself, and so it was as she liked, stunning wallpaper of rose and gold, an abundance of damask and velvet furniture, embroidered pillows and silk trappings for the four-poster bed. Dozens of roses appeared daily for the marble mantels and the inlaid tables, crowding the curtained alcove of her dressing-room, reflected endlessly in tilted mirrors, and finally she crowded the high French windows with a veritable garden of camellia and fern. "I miss the flowers. More than anything else, I miss the flowers," she mused, and sought after them even in the paintings which we brought from the shops and the galleries, magnificent canvases such as I'd never seen in New Orleans, from the classically executed lifelike bouquets, tempting you to reach for the petals that fell on a three-dimensional tablecloth, to a new and disturbing style in which the colors seemed to blaze with such intensity they destroyed the old lines, the old solidity, to make a vision like to those states when I'm nearest my delirium, and flowers grow before my eyes and crackle like the flames of lamps. Paris flowed into these rooms. I found myself at home there, again forsaking dreams of ethereal simplicity for what another's gentle insistence had given me, because the air was sweet like the air of our courtyard in the Rue Royale, and all was alive with a shocking profusion of gas light that rendered even the ornate lofty ceilings devoid of shadows. The light raced on the gilt curlicues, flickered in the baubles of the chandeliers. Darkness did not exist. Vampires did not exist. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. All right, that's another small section of Interview with the Vampire, and just like that, we are finished with part 2 and heading on to part 3 of the novel. Part 2 a lot shorter than part 1. And in part 3, we've moved on to Paris, and we're going to discover a bunch of things alongside Louis and Claudia as regards to the origin of vampires. So what do I have noted down today? The first thing I want to talk about is this really interesting conversation that Louis and Claudia have, where they're musing on the creation of other vampires. Claudia mainly leads this conversation because, as we've discussed previously, Claudia is taking a much more scientific approach. Scientific may not be the perfect word, but she's definitely taking an experimental approach to the creation of vampires and the vampiric condition. But within this, she's also, I feel like, intentionally taunting Louis with the possibility of his victims turning into vampires themselves. This illustrates a couple of things. First thing, I think the first thing this points out is that Claudia doesn't actually love Louis. She's very, very cruel, and she's mimicking Lestat's behaviors in many ways. And the second thing that I think this highlights is that in her mimicking of Lestat's behaviors, she's trying to break down Louis's resistance to her goals and to her desires, and basically just make it so she will do literally anything he asks by breaking him spiritually. There's, in this conversation, there's a less terrible reason given for the Eastern vampires being Eastern European vampires being mindless, where Claudia suggests that perhaps it's because when they die, they get put in a box and they wake up and they're confused and they go crazy, and that's a better explanation. It's just a shame that it turns out that's not the case, as we'll get to a bit later in the novel. It turns out they are just of a strange racial implication to be worse than the Western vampires. So we'll deal with that as it comes up. It also, I think, again, highlights Claudia's dependence on Louis. And it highlights the necessity for Claudia breaking down Louis, in her view, because she wants to conduct these experiments in regards to the creation of other vampires. She wants to make some vampires, see how it's done. But she realizes that she's going to need Louis if she wants to do that, for the simple practical reason that she does not have the volume of blood in her body necessary because she's a child. And so she concludes, I think, in this regard, that she needs to break down Louis through this, taunting him, belittling him, being a bit cruel to him, so that eventually he just caves and accepts that he's going to go ahead and do it anyway, if she actually wants to conduct these experiments. And I think that's the avenue of attack she's taking. Of course, Louis resists enough this time that she drops the subject, but we'll see if she drops it forever. Anyway, another cool thing that I want to talk about here is that Claudia is serving as evidence that vampires are not inherently evil, that they simply adopt evil behaviors as a result of the, mindset their condition brings upon them and the instruction they are given by the vampires who create them. Which is ironic because Claudia would initially seem as complete evidence for the inherently evil nature of vampires. She, is brought into the condition and immediately concludes that this monstrous nature is right because she's not conflicted at all because she never had a prior moral system, and so it comes naturally to her. But this is disproven when Louis recalls an instance when Claudia was unable to kill a woman that resembled her mother, proving that she has retained some of the memories and values instilled in her by her mortal life. And the only reason she has so readily taken on this monstrosity is that she was instructed in it by Louis and Lestat. Primarily Lestat, but Louis is not free of this blame. And this ultimately, just further provides evidence for the fact that there is no divine force or mandate making them act in monstrous manners. Every time the vampires in this text perform an act of cruelty or horrific brutality, they are doing that from their own moral culpability. They have no excuse, functionally. The only character who has something of an excuse is Claudia herself, and that is because she was not provided with the opportunity to form a moral framework counter to it. She is, not she can't really be held culpable when she was embraced as a child and then abused into monstrous acts for her entire life. So yeah, that's interesting. While they're in Eastern Europe, while they're sort of getting ready to leave, Louis reveals that he still holds a longing for Lestat, and Claudia also reveals that she, to some degree, shares this same longing. And we knew this to a degree. We knew Claudia was replacing Lestat in Louis' devotion, shall we say. But it was also very, very clear that entire time that Louis still held some degree of reverence for Lestat. The fact that he didn't stop mentioning it every 5 pages was kind of a hint. And my main argument in regards to this is the fact that Louis and Claudia are haunted by the shadows of Lestat's abuse. They lived under it for 60, 70 years? And they became so accustomed to that ordered structure of existence that it was very, very hard for them to leave that. The main point I want to get across here is that I don't believe there is any supernatural attachment present here. I don't believe there is anything magically dictating that Louis and Claudia should feel a reverence or attachment to Lestat. I think their attachment to Lestat can instead be considered a kind of latent Stockholm syndrome it would be very typical of the relationship of abusive dependency that Lestat fostered amongst his victims. And Claudia ultimately concludes that they need to go to Paris to be in a familiar surrounding, culturally speaking, in order to be able to recover from this longing and dependence. So, in a way, the traveling to Paris is a kind of coping mechanism that Claudia realizes by perhaps having this degree of familiarity present, they will be able to, over time, overcome the dependence that Lestat fostered in them. So that's cool. And when they arrive in Paris, it's very fitting that they go immediately to Paris, because of course Claudia observes they're going to Paris as a coping mechanism, but also it's just, fitting, as I've observed before, that Paris is the capital of the colonial nation which spawned New Orleans. The colonial vampire essentially is returning to the motherland in Louis, because Louis, of course, was from the continent originally. He wasn't born in America. He says so himself. So it is fitting that Louis is returning to Paris now as a vampire, as a reversal of the colonial vampirism and exploitation that Paris sent out into New Orleans. Which I verbalized it as I came across it, but there was a very iffy description of New Orleans in regards to it being a more savage reflection of Paris, and an extensive description being gone into that regard. And Louis justifies this away in terms of weather, the hurricanes, the storms and whatnot. This is Louis we're talking about. Louis said a lot of very racy things throughout this text, and so I can't help but read some underlying racial implications to his description of New Orleans as a savage reflection of Paris. I think what Louis is really idolizing about Paris is this quote-unquote cultural idealism, or its, true... The fact that he believes New Orleans to be a poor reflection of Paris suggests that not only aesthetically but also culturally, there is something about Paris which he holds above that of New Orleans. And I would think, given the trend Louis has shown, it's very likely that that cultural thing is its racial, what would be a word for? Just consistent demographic and cultural attitude, shall we say. It's people who fit in with his kind, in both the sense of his very, very aristocratic behaviors, but also in regards to his exploitative natures, and in that he's a vampire. He is a literal vampire, and the population of Paris were originally colonial vampires, or I should say the elite of Paris. That's another interesting thing to discuss. Final thing I have noted down here about today's segment relates to Louis's wealth. I've been talking about Louis's wealth a lot, and I just have another little example for you about how important this money actually is, even if they try to say it isn't. Louis's wealth is what affords them, Louis and Claudia, the privacy and security in the hotel that they require. And he admits this himself. He admits that it is the lavish fee that he's paying for this hotel that is able to afford him the privacy that allows him to function as a vampire more easily within Paris. And this means that money is, of course, incredibly important to them. And I guess the main point I want to get across in regards to that is the fact that they really just take this money for granted. Louis just pretends the money isn't that important to him. Every now and again, he'll say that he didn't care about money that much. But we just see in the text that if Louis did not have access to the immense financial resources that he does, he would have a significantly more difficult time of operating as a vampire. And we see this, I think, no better in the fact that Claudia is, first of all, mandating the expenses. So she's taking the role Lestat had in basically functioning as Louis's, treating Louis's money as though it were her own and spending it very, very lavishly. But she's also taking on Lestat's irritation at not being fully in control of the finances, because I think Claudia recognizes more than Louis does that without this money they are in a significantly more difficult position. And it's also a case that Claudia likes nice things and likes surrounding herself with, lavish surroundings, luxury and whatnot. In a way, she's been raised as a kind of spoiled child, and in terms of getting whatever she wants economically, so she can't understand the concept of not being allowed that. And I don't think any of the characters can thus far, any of the vampires really, Louis included. It's just Louis has this businessman facade about him, where he pretends he has this faux stinginess, I'm sure there are many, many terms I could use to describe it, but I'm sure you understand what I'm getting at here, where Louis wants to give off this perception of himself as very shrewd, very businessman-like, when in reality he is, just as reliant on money as everyone else. Anyway, that is that section. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time we're going to get into some really, really interesting stuff, and we're going to see if they can find any vampires in Paris after all. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you tomorrow.